white cis man with red hair, a red beard that is slowly going to gray. I'm wearing a green shirt, green button-up shirt and blue jeans. Just a announcement on the books is let's the theme of the book sales today is let's make a deal because we don't want to lug them back. So um by a way. Um so um it is my honor today to introduce this year's Emerging Scholar Lecture, a dear friend of mine, and a participant of many ITDs. Emma C.W. Ceruti C.Ho is a disabled neurodivergent theologian who recently received a PhD in theological studies from Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. She also holds a MA in systematic theology from UN Theological Seminary, where she studied under James Cone. Her dissertation develops a constructive disability theology rooted in first-person disabled experience. I think by Christian mysticism and liberation theology. She is the co-editor with Miriam Spice of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health and Disability, and the co-host of the Mad and Crip Theology podcast. I run the fact about is she tried to get a bookmark to be certified the largest bookmark by the Guinness Book of World Records. And they responded, we can't verify that. So she is claiming to have the world's largest bookmark, and no one has yet to prove her wrong. Please join me in welcoming the Dr. Emma Ceruti to the podium.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much, Greg, for introducing me. I was very excited that Greg was going to introduce me today. Yes, my name is Emma, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a short white woman with brownish hair that's very gray and white because of the dissertation and parenting. And I'm wearing reddish glasses, a green pantsuit, which is covering my birthmark that is very purple and goes from my toes all the way up to my lower back. So I have one purple butt cheek. And I'm, yeah, a green pantsuit, and I have lovely indigenous handmade earrings, beaded earrings that are really pretty. And you can come up to me and ask to feel them because they're really fun to feel too. And yes, I am, like Greg said, I'm the co-editor of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health and Disability, and co-host of the Mad and Crip Theology podcast. We have a call for papers out. The information is at the end of me and Miriam's paper. But you can also find us online, and please come and ask me about the journal. We are doing a special issue on displaced studies and disability theology. So we'd love for anyone who presented or didn't present, but would love to contribute. Yes, so we'll get started, and I will note that I will describe all the images on this screen. Um, and I like to highlight as many disabled artists as I can. So if you get a chance, please check out the slides, because all the information of the artists are there with links, so you can check them out further. The title of my lecture today is Disability, Mysticism, and Liberation. It comes out of my dissertation, Doing and Undoing Disability Theology, a mystical-liberative approach to the cross. And I'm going to be talking about mysticism broadly, but the mystics that I use, that I like to name drop, are I use Simone Weil, Dorte Zola, and Juliana Norwich in my dissertation. So you're also welcome to ask me lots of questions about it after. The image on the screen now is the title, Disability, Mysticism, Liberation, with the Institute name underneath. And then the image, okay, I'm going to just pick it up because I can't read. It's a painting by artist Laura Schroer, and it was featured in the 2021 edition of Bodies in Translation No Access Collage, which is a really great website that you should check out. They're based out of the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And they do a lot of research activist art from disabled perspectives. And I do want to briefly read what Laura says about her piece. She writes, quote, "There is a feeling of reflection to send us wings. It feels like a meadow of faith that wants to spring. Its home is the heaven of goodness to make us strong. We climb up to the hill of experience to where we belong." And it's a very vibrant, expressive painting. It's got these stylized human figures with very colorful fan-like headdresses against a very red background. Next slide, please. So let's begin. Published shortly after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, Nancy Eastland's The Disabled God fundamentally reshaped the theological landscape of disability. Drawing on her experience as a disabled activist and sociologist, Eastland bridged the gap between disability studies and systematic theology by introducing the minority model as a way for theologians and churches to recognize the social and ecclesial realities facing disabled people. Against dominant theological traditions that render disabled people pitiable, sinful, deficient, or invisible, Eastland offers a disability-centered reinterpretation of the divine through the image of the disabled God, a resurrected Christ who still bears the wounds of crucifixion. Her intervention was not merely symbolic. Disability theology emerged in response to concrete histories of exclusion and inaccessibility within both church and society. As Eastland writes, quote, "For many disabled persons, the church has been a city on a hill, physically inaccessible and socially inhospitable," end quote. On the screen, we have a line drawing of a church on a hill, and it says "a city on a hill." And then I added, this was not part of the image, next to it in red letters, "physically inaccessible, socially inhospitable." Disability theology, therefore, developed not only as an academic project, but as a liberatory response to the marginalization of disabled people within Christian communities, theological discourse, and social life more broadly. More than 30 years later, disability theology has become a rich and expanding field. Scholars have transformed conversations surrounding, next slide, please. And it lists everything I'm saying now on the screen. Scholars have transformed conversations surrounding ecclesiology, the sacraments, theological anthropology, pastoral care, biblical studies, and ministry with people with intellectual disabilities. Disability theology has powerfully challenged theological ableism and reimagined disabled embodiment as revelatory rather than deficient. It has insisted that disability is not marginal to human existence, but constitutive of it. Through illness, injury, aging, and the care of others, disability theology touches us all, revealing the fragility and interdependence at the heart of human life. Next slide, please. And yet, I want to suggest today that something remains underdeveloped within the field. Much of disability theology has rightly focused on inclusion, access, and representation, which is very important. These interventions remain indispensable, but disability theology often remains insufficiently transformative at the level of spiritual imagination, relational ontology, and collective liberation. What remains underdeveloped is an approach attentive not only to the social and ecclesial exclusion of disabled people, but also to the spiritual transformations that emerge through first-person experiences of disability and the communities formed by collective struggle. And the question is on the screen now. What theological possibilities emerge when disabled/crip people are understood not merely as recipients of welcome or inclusion, but as interpreters of spiritual and social transformation? I argue that disability needs what I term a quote, mystical-liberative approach. What is ultimately at stake is not merely inclusion within existing structures, but the transformation of the theological imagination and communal life. Next slide, please. My thesis statement's on the screen now. Disability theology. Oh, I argue, nope, I'm not there yet. There we go. Disability theology requires a mystical-liberative approach because disabled crip experience reveals forms of divine encounter, theological knowledge, political resistance, and collective transformation that merge when spirituality, liberation, and disabled epistemology are held together. I see that disability theology has long contained these mystical liberative impulses, but these dimensions have not yet been fully synthesized into a coherent theological framework. Drawing from liberation theology, Christian mysticism, and disabled crip lived experience, I argue that liberation is not merely structural, political, or ecclesial, though it is certainly all of those things. Liberation is also spiritual, relational, epistemological. Oppression shapes not only bodies and institutions, but also one's understanding of God, self, and community. Consequently, liberation involves transformed ways of inhabiting the body, encountering God, and imagining collective life otherwise. I want to acknowledge that a framework I am proposing emerges from my own situated location as a Christian. A mystical liberative approach to disability theology, though I argue can extend beyond Christianity into other religious traditions and even non-religious disabled crip communities. My goal is not to offer a universal account of disability and spirituality, but to articulate a framework that synthesizes certain dimensions of disability theology that are often treated separately: liberation, disabled epistemology, spirituality, and social critique. A mystical liberative approach names these connections more explicitly and asks what becomes possible when they are held together within a shared theological framework. In this lecture, I argue for rereading disability theology through a mystical liberative lens. And next slide, please. On the screen now, I have my overview with 5 parts, so I'll read that out. I will begin by examining dominant approaches within disability theology and the unresolved methodological tensions surrounding liberation theology, spirituality, and disabled theological authority. I will then, part two, distinguish mysticism from general notions of spirituality and clarify what I mean in particular by mystical liberative theology, by situating this framework within broader liberationist and mystical traditions. And part three, from there, I will argue that disability theology already contains mystical liberative dimensions that emerge from disabled crip embodiment and are expressed through symbolic images of the divine. So through comparative readings of Nancy Eastland and Julia Watts-Belser, hopefully she's online hearing this, I will suggest that these symbolic forms not only challenge ableist theological assumptions, but also reconfigure how divine encounter and collective life are imagined across diverse traditions. And finally, part five, I will argue that rereading disability theology through a mystical liberative lens ultimately reshapes mysticism itself, making mysticism more relational in ways demonstrated by crip community building. So to begin, then we must first examine how disability theology has developed and where the relationships among liberation, spirituality, and disabled theological authority remain insufficiently theorized. Next slide, please. So on the screen now we have part one, methodological tensions within disability theology. And there's an image of the book cover art for volume one of Nothing Without Us, edited by Kate Gordon and Talia C. Johnson. It's published by Renaissance Press from 2019. And it has a Nothing Without Us in black letters on a brick background. And I also included the link of a review by Sherry Pine because I really loved the way that she described their book. She says, what might give an inkling of overall feeling is a little excerpt from the editor's defiantly lit nerd epic poem style call for submissions, and this is quoting the editors. Bring us your deaf heroes, your disabled, your neurodiverse, your characters breaking free from the shackles of normativity. Those who are not refuse but fabulous. Send these your homeless stories, tempest tossed to us, end quote. So check out the links because it's pretty great. Disability theology, I argue, has never been methodologically unified. From its very inception, the field has contained conflicting assumptions about liberation, theological, structural critique, and theological authority, and the role of disabled experience in theological knowledge itself. These tensions become most apparent in questions surrounding whom disability theology is written for, who has authority to construct it, and whether disabled people are approached primarily as objects of theological reflection or as subjects of theological interpretation and transformation. Disabled theologian Becca Anderson, who's right in front of me. Next slide, please. So Becca Anderson captured these tensions powerfully in an ITD plenary session in 2023, describing her experience reading The Disabled God as Transformative. For the first time, and I would say mine as well, and I've heard from many others the same, Anderson encountered a theology that spoke to her as a disabled person rather than merely about disability for a presumed non-disabled audience. Her reflection exposes a significant tension in the field, despite the groundbreaking work of disabled theologians, such as Nancy Eastland. Of the majority of disability theology, of the majority, disability theology has often been shaped primarily by non-disabled scholars writing as caregivers, allies, clinicians, ministers, family members of disabled people. These scholars have made important and deeply compassionate contributions. But when disability theology is approached primarily through caregiving relationships or non-disabled observation, disability can remain an object of theological reflection rather than an epistemological standpoint from which theology is constructed. As Anderson observes, much theological discourse still feels, quote, about disabled people, rather than generally, quote, for disabled people. The rallying cry of the disability rights movement, quote, nothing about us without us, end quote, therefore carries profound theological implications. It raises difficult but necessary questions. What happens when a theological discourse that emerged as a way for disabled crip people to name our own experiences and images of God becomes shaped primarily through non-disabled frameworks of care, inclusion, and interpretation? What is at stake when disability theology is no longer clearly accountable to disabled crip communities? When disabled readers like Anderson and myself struggle to recognize ourselves in texts that claim to describe us. And on the screen, I have the question that kind of summarizes all those questions. What happens when disability theology is shaped primarily through the non-disabled gaze? Next slide, please. Thank you. On the screen, I have quite a lot of disabled theologians, and we'll get through all their image descriptions one by one. In recent years, more disabled scholars have begun reshaping the field through explicitly first-person and disability-centered methodologies. So the scholars on the screen, which I have in alphabetical order, are Julia Watts-Belzer, which we heard from earlier. She's seated in a wheelchair with a blue shirt, and she's a white woman with a hat and glasses. We have Sharon Betcher, who is a white woman with short blonde hair with glasses. Monica Coleman, who's a black woman with braids, earrings, shell earrings, a black shirt. Shane Clifton, who's in a wheelchair wearing a tie, a white man with brown, blondish hair. I don't know where that line from blonde to brown goes. David Finnegan Hosey, a white man with a beard, blue shirt. Lamar Hardwick, and he's wearing glasses, a black man, a beard, and a black hoodie. Kendrick Lamar, who's a black man wearing glasses, wearing a white shirt and a blazer. Amy Kenny, who's in a scooter and wearing a purple blouse, a white woman with blonde hair and a blue background. Naomi Lawson Jacobs, who is, I believe in this photo, in a wheelchair, but is kind of cut out. She's holding a microphone, a white woman with brown hair and a hoodie. Emily Richardson, who's a white woman with red hair, glasses, and a red shirt. So all of these scholars have increasingly centered their own lived experience as a source of theological knowledge, rather than merely a topic of theological reflection. Their work pushes disability theology beyond mere inclusion toward a deeper methodological shift, one that reorients theological knowledge production toward disabled ways of encountering the divine. These developments have significantly expanded the field, but they have not yet fully resolved the broader methodological tensions. Next slide, please. These tensions become most profound, most pronounced upon reviewing conflicting approaches to liberation theology. Some disability theologians have become hesitant to adopt liberation theology as a primary framework. So scholars such as Hans Reinders and John Swinton have expressed concern that liberation theology can overemphasize political and structural analysis of the at the expense of relationality, care, and belonging. So on the screen now, we have engagement with liberation theology. And I have three categories: critical, and we have Hans Reinders, John Swinton; implicit, Amos Young, Thomas Reynolds; explicit, Lisa Powell, Mary Jo Iozio. Particularly in conversations surrounding intellectual disability with Reinders and Swinton, Swinton and Reinders worry that a liberationist framework risks prioritizing autonomy, agency, and rights-based discourse in ways that inadequately account for quote unquote profound dependency and vulnerability. Yet other disability theologians, such as Lisa Powell, argue that rejecting liberation theology reveals a deeper reluctance to engage the structural and economic dimensions of ableism itself. I draw from a lot of ITD plenaries, so it's exciting to be here to be able to build on them. Lisa Powell observed in an ITD plenary in 2024, disabled lives are profoundly shaped not only by interpersonal relationships of care and belonging, but also by institutional exclusion, economic precarity, political abandonment, and broader systems of power that determine whose bodies are supported and whose are rendered disposable. Next slide, please. So on the screen, I have the cover art, the book cover art for Lisa Powell, the book, The Disabled God Revisited, Trinity, Christology, and Liberation by Bloomsbury. And it's kind of an expressive painting of a figure that's yellow and blue with red accents against a gray background sitting in a wheelchair. And next to that cover art, I have the question, can disability theology address structural ableism without liberation theology? As a result, approaches that reject liberation theology often shift theological attention away from systemic critique. Powell's critique underscores the importance of maintaining a liberatory framework within disability theology, rather than siloing off questions of care and belonging from broader systems of injustice and exclusion. At the same time, variances between disability theology and liberation theology are not simply drawn along lines of rejection, as in with Reinders and Swinton, versus acceptance. Next slide, please. Oh, not yet. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Even theologians who distance themselves from liberation theology frequently retain liberatory impulses in their work. Amos Young, for example, develops what he calls a, quote, disability hermeneutic, foregrounding the experiences of disabled people and challenging exclusionary theological norms in ways that explicitly echo the preferential option for the marginalized. Likewise, Thomas Reynolds emphasizes vulnerability, interdependence, and divine solidarity as sites of theological conversion and relational transformation. In Reynolds' book, Vulnerable Communion, Reynolds critiques what he calls the cult of normalcy and the social production of, quote, body capital, while rejecting idealized visions of autonomy and bodily perfection, advocating instead for communities shaped by mutuality, welcome, and belonging. These are deeply important contributions. Yet Reynolds' reliance on Jean Vanier as a theological resource, written well before allegations of sexual abuse on Vanier's part were publicized, reveals the limits of vulnerability discourse when detached from structural critique and questions of power. Though some theologians, apart from Reynolds, continue to reclaim aspects of Vanier's theology even after revelations of his abuse, I remain skeptical of any disability theology constructed from the writings of an abuser, particularly on the subject of vulnerability itself. A theology that invokes mutuality and belonging without engaging the material conditions thereof risks becoming an exercise in sentimentality rather than justice. For this reason, implicitly liberatory language alone is insufficient. Without an explicit engagement with liberation theology's structural, political, and epistemological commitments, disability theology risks affirming inclusion and mutuality without fully confronting the systems of power that shape disabled life. If disability theology is to confront ableism as a structural and theological reality rather than merely as an interpersonal concern, liberation theology cannot remain implicit. Some disability theologians therefore engage liberation theology explicitly and directly as a necessary methodological framework for disability theology itself. Mary Jo Iozio, for example, grounds her work in Catholic social teaching and argues that disability theology must be shaped by the preferential option for the poor. In her book, Disability Ethics and Preferential Justice, she insists that disabled people must be understood through the material realities of exclusion, poverty, and systemic injustice. For Iozio, theological inclusion demands more than compassion and welcome. It requires structural transformation. Questions of housing, education, employment, healthcare, and access become theological concerns because liberation is inseparable from the conditions that allow people to flourish collectively. Her work demonstrates how disability theology can reclaim liberation theology not merely as a political framework, but as a theological commitment to justice grounded in solidarity with those historically excluded from full participation in church and society. Yet even Iozio's explicit liberationist approach does not fully engage the spiritual and transformative dimensions of disabled crip experience itself. It is precisely within these unresolved tensions that I locate the need for what I call a mystical liberative approach to disability theology. Now, next slide. I just got excited earlier. So now we're finally at part 2, mystical liberative approach. And the painting on the screen now is done by David Vincent. It's featured on the Instagram for TED Abstract. The link is again in the slide, which you have access to. David writes, quote, "My artistic process is a voyage toward complete liberation. Having an end result is the antithesis of creating. I'm deeply drawn to mystical occurrences, the raw beauty of nature and its elemental forces, abandoned and disparaged material things, the faded, the tampered with, the elusive markings on physical objects, the torn apart, the torn into the scrapes, and the expansion of life that is eternally recreating itself. These fascinations serve as the springboard from which all my works emerge. I have no direct goal other than to devote myself to a limitless process without expectation," end quote. And sorry, I had to burp. You didn't need to hear it though. The image, so the painting is abstract with vibrant splashes of red, yellow, and white against a black background. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so I want to first clarify what I mean by a mystical liberative approach and why I believe such a framework is necessary for disability theology today. Because terms such as, quote, spirituality, quote, mysticism, quote, liberation, and even, quote, salvation can be conflated on the one hand or treated as mutually exclusive on the other. It is important to define them carefully. So to begin, spirituality and mysticism are not synonymous. On the screen, I have two charts, and they summarize what I'm about to say. So I'll describe them first. There's spirituality with an equal sign and a dash through, and mysticism. And underneath that is a chart that has spirituality, which underneath goes broad, meaning making, practice, connection, mysticism, and then under that is specific, divine encounter, transformation, reorientation. And then on the other side, there's liberation with a equal sign slash through salvation. I talk with my hands, so we're both moving a lot up here. um, Liberation, and then underneath that column is historical, structural, political, collective flourishing. And then the next column is salvation, eschatological, ultimate, divine reconciliation, participation with God. Okay, so let's unpack that. So to begin, spirituality and mysticism are not synonymous. This distinction matters because while disability theology has certainly engaged spirituality in important ways, particularly through pastoral theology, it has often remained under-theorized as a mystical framework attentive to disabled crip embodiment, relational transformation, and collective liberation. Spirituality, as I defined it, is a broad category that can refer to religious practice, meaning making, prayer, ritual, ethical orientation, or experiences of connection and transcendence. Mysticism, however, again, as I define it, refers more specifically to an embodied and transformative encounter with divine presence that doesn't necessarily have to be capital G God, that reorient or perception, reshape relationships, and generate new ways of being and acting in the world. Trust from such transformation often reconfigures how one understands embodiment, interdependence, and communal life. In this sense, to summarize, all mysticism is spiritual, but not all spirituality is mystical. And yet, within modern theological reception, Christian mysticism has often been imagined as intensely personal, apolitical experience, an ascent of the soul, a unitive encounter, or a retreat from the world into interior contemplation. In this dominant framing, mysticism becomes detached from embodiment, historical suffering, and social struggle. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that mysticism is neither static nor universally agreed upon category. Pre-modern mystical texts, such as those that I examine with Julian Norwich, emerge within a very particular theological, liturgical, and historical context and cannot simply be collapsed into modern experiential understandings of spirituality or consciousness. My concern here is therefore not to produce a historical taxonomy of mysticism from the Middle Ages to modernity. That is someone else's job, and I will not do it. But to read mystical and liberative traditions constructively and theologically for the present. I am especially interested in how contemporary liberation theologians retrieve mystical traditions in ways that connect divine encounter to embodiment, suffering, and collective transformation. Likewise, liberation and salvation are interrelated yet distinct theological categories as I define them. Liberation names the historical and embodied processes through which persons and communities resist oppression, confront structures of injustice, and reclaim the possibility of collective flourishing. Liberation theology insists that questions of suffering, embodiment, poverty, exclusion, and political power are not secondary to theology, but central to it. At the same time, liberation is not reducible to political transformation alone. Liberation also involves transformation in how people understand themselves, one another, the environment, and the divine. Salvation, however, as I define it, names the wider theological horizon in which liberation participates, but which it does not exhaust. Salvation refers to participation in divine life and the ultimate reconciliation of creation with God or the divine. While liberation manifests God's transforming work within history, salvation names the fuller realization of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Salvation, therefore, carries an eschatological horizon that exceeds the reach of human effort or political transformation alone. It is precisely this intersection of mysticism and liberation that several liberation and political theologians have sought to develop more explicitly over the last half century. Next slide, please. So on the screen now, I have liberation and political theologians. There's 5, and these are liberation and political theologians who have explicitly written and extensively written on liberation and mysticism. So from left to right, we have Gustavo Gutierrez, who is Peruvian. He's got white hair, like tanner skin, glasses, and he's wearing like a jacket behind. It's a really colorful background. Then we have Leonardo Both, who's a white man with white beard, glasses, red shirt. Then next to him is Dorte Zola, my girl. She's a white woman with short gray hair, purple sweater, and she's outside. And then we have Johann Baptist Metz, who's a white man with glasses, white hair. They're all older, so yeah, wearing a black and white polka dot shirt. And then next to him is Edward Schillebeeckx, which I never want to spell ever again. And he's got a white hair, white man glasses outside. I'm really hoping that the field expands and more people of color, more women, more queer people, disabled people can contribute to this connection between mysticism and liberation. So all of these scholars that I've named on this screen, I'm going to take a water break, have each challenged modern assumptions that mysticism is primarily inward, private, or detached from political life. Instead, they argue that divine encounter occurs within history, amid suffering, resistance, and communal struggle for liberation. So to summarize kind of all of them as best as I could in a sentence each. Gutierrez describes theological contemplation and solidarity with the poor as inseparable. Boff reimagines mysticism as a way of perceiving grace in the midst of marginalization and resistance. Zola critiques forms of bourgeoisie, mysticism that retreat from the world rather than confronting injustice. Metz describes mysticism as interpretation, what he calls a dangerous memory, shocking systems that otherwise normalize suffering and exclusion. Schillebeeckx argues that the mystical and political are 2 dimensions of a single Christian praxis. And all of these scholars are footnoted, so if you want to read more, check out the footnotes. I have very extensive footnotes. Across these thinkers, mysticism is reimagined not as escape from the world, but as deeper participation within it. Spiritual transformation and political transformation become inseparable. Mystical experience compels solidarity, resistance, and collective reimagining. It is within this broader theological trajectory that I situate what I call a mystical liberative approach, which refuses the separation of personal spiritual transformation from collective liberation. It understands that disability not merely as a social reality to analyze or a private spiritual experience, but as a potential site of theological revelation, relational transformation, resistance, and reimagined collective life. Importantly, this does not mean that disability, oppression, and vulnerability are inherently holy or redemptive. Nor does it mean structural injustice should be spiritualized or passively endured. Disability theology has rightly challenged theological traditions that romanticize suffering, sanctify ableism, and replace structural critique with inward spirituality. Rather, a mystical liberative approach understands transformation not as transcendence away from embodiment, but as a deeper inhabitation of embodied existence and interdependence. It recognizes that disabled crip experiences can expose the instability of cultural ideas such as autonomy, productivity, self-sufficiency, and bodily perfection, while simultaneously revealing alternate forms of crip community. Next slide, please. Okay, we're getting to part 3. So here is where we're going to reread disability theology through a mystical liberative lens. And on the screen, I have it's like a section from a mural by Rafael Delgado. And this was featured in Disability Rights California's new art mural for Sacramento's Wide Open Walls Festival. The link is there in the slide notes. Raphael's mural depicts this personification of of blind justice, but as he states, quote, "This time we've interpreted it differently," end quote. The figure whom he says says it has this non-binary elements. They uses a prosthesis in form of a sword in place of one of their legs, and one of their arms is replaced by a wing meant to uplift and protect. And the section on the screen of the mural, so you should definitely check out the whole mural because it's like really rad. But the section on the screen is a depiction of two people, two purple faces split in half. The one on the left is in profile with a rainbow spectrum like radiating from their eyes. It's cool, like lasers almost. And the one on the right is facing straight ahead, wearing a blindfold with orange half circles emerging from their ear. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. Through comparative readings of Nancy Eastland and Julia Watts-Belser, I demonstrate how display theology generates mystical liberative symbols across religious traditions. More specifically, I suggest the works of Eastland and Belser each display what I identify as 3 central characteristics of a mystical liberative approach. So these are characteristics that I've come up with. And you're welcome to cite the presentation. I love a good citation. The first is a revelatory image emerging from lived experience, particularly experiences of suffering and survival. 2, a critique of dominant theological symbols and power structures. 3, a transformative reorientation toward justice, embodiment, and collective life. And those 3 are on the screen, and you'll see them again. These characteristics become especially apparent through Eastland and Watts-Belser's central divine images. Eastland's disabled God in a sip-puff wheelchair, and Belser's God on wheels. I really hope she's online. Which functions simultaneously through apophatic, cataphatic, prophetic, and liberative dimensions. Don't worry, we'll get through each of those. Next slide, please. So first, Nancy Eastland. Eastland's on the screen now. So we have her book cover art on the left, and it's got a red top where it says like the disabled God in toward a liberatory theology of disability, white letters on a red background. And this has got also a, like, oh my goodness, very abstract, very, very colorful. I think there's like legs in there too, but I'm not too sure everything that's in there because it's very abstract, but it's very colorful, with greens and yellows and blues and oranges and whites. And then next to that book cover art, we have Nancy Eastlin. She's a white woman with short brown hair, wearing a yellow shirt and a green scarf, and she's smiling on a mobility scooter in front of a stone church. It's outdoors. So first, Nancy Eastlin displays the next slide, please. Thank you. See, I said it. I told you I'd come back again. So the three characteristics on the screen again. So Nancy Eastlin first displays the emergence of a liberatory image grounded in lived experience, particularly the experiences of suffering and survival. In her book, The Disabled God, she develops one of the most striking theological images in contemporary Christian thought. Next slide, please. She writes, the quote is on the screen now, quote, "I saw God in a sit-puff wheelchair. That is the chair used mostly by quadriplegics, enabling them to maneuver by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. In this moment, I beheld God as a survivor, unpitying and forthright. I recognized the incarnate Christ in the image of those judged not feasible, unemployable, with questionable quality of life. Here was God for me," end quote. And next to that quote, I have an image of a TikTok influencer, Janie Carter. She's a white woman in a sit-puff wheelchair, seated at a table with a laptop indoors. She's got her hair pulled back in a ponytail and is wearing a gray shirt and blue jeans. And her sit-puff wheelchair, you can see that the straw is resting at her mouth. And you can watch her on TikTok demonstrating how it moves by blowing and sucking forward, back, side to side. So this image of God in a sit-puff wheelchair, I argue, functions as revelation. Divine presence is disclosed through disabled embodiment itself. God appears not as an able-bodied ideal, nor as the healer who eradicates disability, but as a disabled survivor. Like the mystical liberative theologians discussed earlier, Eastlin locates divine encounter within the lived realities of oppression, survival, and resistance. This revelation emerges through what she later calls body knowledge, the lived knowledge that comes from inhabiting a disabled body within an ableist world. Her vision is therefore distinctly mystical liberative, emerging from embodied marginalization and calling forth transformed social and theological realities. Next slide, please. So we've got the characteristics on the slide again. Second, I argue Eastlin displays a critique of dominant theological symbols and power structures. The disabled God rejects theological assumptions that equate divinity with able-bodiedness, autonomy, invulnerability, and self-sufficiency. God is not the triumphant figure untouched by limitation, dependency, or woundedness, nor is resurrected imagined as the erasure of disability. Instead, the resurrected Christ still bears the wounds of crucifixion. Eastlin exposes how theological symbols of perfection reinforce cultural ideals of autonomy, productivity, and bodily normalcy. Her theology interrupts dominant assumptions about healing, wholeness, agency, and worth, while calling on the church to confront its participation in ableist structures. Disabled bodies become sites of divine presence and theological knowledge. And three, Eastlin displays a transformative reorientation toward justice and collective life. The disabled God reorients Christian community around interdependence, rather than autonomy, accessibility rather than exclusion, and collective crypt becoming rather than bodily conformity. Disabled crypt bodies are no longer treated as objects of pity, one-directional ministry, or theological explanation, but as sacred sites of revelation and sources of theological wisdom. If disabled embodiment reveals divine presence, then churches, theological institutions, and broader structural social structures must themselves be transformed. Contemplation becomes inseparable from justice, revelation from solidarity, and spirituality from collective liberation. Eastland's mystical liberative approach becomes evident through the symbolic operations of her central divine image, which functions simultaneously, next slide please, through apophatic, cataphatic, prophetic, and liberative dimensions. So on the screen now we have Eastland's disabled God as ... Apophatic, and underneath it says negates false images. Cataphatic creates new images. Prophetic reimagines futures. Liberative transforms structures. And underneath that is just like right across mystical experience. So first, I argue the disabled God functions apophatically. This means that God is understood through negation and disruption of inadequate theological images. By destabilizing assumptions that equate divine perfection with bodily normalcy, autonomy, and invulnerability, Eastland opens a space for a radically different theological imagination. Second, the disabled God functions cataphatically, which can be spelled with a C or a K just in case there's confusion. And this means that the new symbolic images are offered through which divine presence can be encountered. In the image of Christ in a sit-puff wheelchair, disability becomes a locus of divine self-disclosure. Disabled embodiment centers Christian symbolism in ways theology has often resisted or ignored. Third, the disabled God functions prophetically by exposing and reimagining. Eastland unmasks what theologian Mark Jordan calls, quote, holy distortions, while simultaneously imagining a future in which crippled and disabled people are recognized as bearers of divine presence and theological wisdom within a church reordered around disabled justice.
Just a gentle time check, Emma. You have about 11 minutes.
Okay.
It's currently 10:18.
Thank you so much. Okay, so the disabled God functions liberatively. That's the last part for Eastland, as a site of disabled embodiment for divine presence, and equips both church and communities with new theological images and language. Next slide, please. Okay, now we have Julia Watts-Belser on the screen. On the left is her book cover, Loving Our Bones, Loving Our Own Bones, Disability, Wisdom, and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. And it's got like a yellow background with a tree. And then we have Julia Watts-Belser, who's in her wheelchair with a red top, matching hat, white woman with short brown hair and glasses, and she's outside smiling. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Belser's work, I argue, also likewise displays these three central characteristics, which they're on the screen again. I argue that she displays the emergence of a liberatory image grounded in lived experience. At the center of Loving Our Own Bones is another striking theological image, God on wheels. Next slide, please. Reflecting on Ezekiel's chariot vision, Belser becomes captivated by the wheels of divine chariot and rereads them through her own experience as a wheelchair user. She writes, and the quote is on the screen now, Ezekiel's vision split open my own imagination. As I was reading that description of God's divine chariot, I felt a jolt of recognition, an intimate familiarity, a whimsical sense of kinship. I thought, God has wheels. And next to that is a depiction of that image. It's like got this dynamic expressionist painting by Olivia Wise, where it's a figure with their arms uplifted and they're covered in this red outfit, and it's a lot of movement with very blurred strokes. What emerges from Belser's reading of Ezekiel is revelation. God is encountered through wheelchair movement, disabled embodiment, breath, friction, terrain, and access. Like Eastland's sit-puff wheelchair, Belser's God on Wheels discloses divine presence through disabled experience. Next slide, please. Belser displays a transformative, okay, never mind. Belser argues God knows wheels, quote, from the inside out. And this revelation emerges through this embodied experience, what Eastland calls body knowledge. She interprets Ezekiel's strange angelic beings, these fused legs, rigid movement, multi-directional wheels, and breath-powered motion as resonant with disabled crip embodiment, suggesting that divine encounter emerges through bodily particularity. And that is listed on the screen about Ezekiel's angelic beings. And there's a depiction of this with these wheels all enfolded, an eye in the center, and lots of wings around it. Belser displays a critique of dominant theological symbols and power structures with these images. Next slide, please. She challenges theological understandings of humanity that define the Imago Dei through reason, speech, upright posture, independence, and normative bodily function. In doing so, she exposes how theological ideals of the human have historically excluded disabled people. And I argue that her critique extends beyond ableism. She also challenges human exceptionalism itself. So she talked about this yesterday, the assumption that humans uniquely mirror God in ways that elevate humanity over other creatures and forms of life. Third, Belser displays a transformative reorientation toward justice. And that's that third characteristic. I argue that her spirituality is at once mystical and material. Holiness is encountered through her wheels catching on an uneven pavement, her breath moving technology in rough bricks spinning in every form that disabled crip bodies encounter. Next slide, please. So on the screen now we have Belser's God on Wheels, and it's just like the one for Eastland. And it says apophatic, again, negates false images. Cataphatic, creates new images. Prophetic, reimagines futures. Liberative, transforms structures. And I'm going to keep going because I know we're getting close on time. Thank you. So I argue really that Eastland and Belser don't simply fit within an existing mystical tradition. They reshape really the meaning of mysticism itself. They make it more embodied, relational, political, accessible, and accountable to live experience. We're going to go all the way to part 4 if you want to click. So I have on the screen an image of Dorothy Zola's book, The Silent Cry. And it's, again, bold, dramatic, like geometric figures. This is Mysticism Reimagined. We're going to go to the next slide. And this is where I argue that Eastland and Belser, again, that they really transform mysticism. They make mysticism more, they make it embodied, communal, political, disruptive, and generative. And that's on the screen now. I'm going to go to the next slide. And then a couple more to get to part 5. Keep going. Great, thank you. Okay, we've made it. We're almost there. This it says part 5, mystical dash liberative practices in crypt community. And stop me if I don't get through it all, and we can always talk about it after. The image is a photograph from cryptistemologies, that's a hard word to say, of display arts culture reflections on Cripping the Arts Symposium, which is a special issue, and the link is in the notes. And it's got this dancer completely covered in this bright pink stretchy costume that like twists and turns. I was gonna wear it, but I think I would just sweat too much, to be honest. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. So I argue that if disability theology transforms mysticism in the ways of being embodied, relational, political, accessible, and accountable to lived experience, the question is not only how we think differently about mysticism, but how we practice differently in disabled crypt community. A mystical liberative approach is not meant to remain an abstract theological framework. It calls for communal practices that make divine encounter, access, interdependence, collective care materially real. So on the screen now, I have these 4 practices listed. 1, access as spiritual practice. And I know that a lot of scholars have written about this. And if you want recommendations, I'd love for you to come after and talk to me. 2, center disabled knowledge. 3, collective care. And 4, imagine futures otherwise. Next slide, please. Thank you. Eastland argues, quote, a theological method must provide two-way access. Persons with disabilities must gain access to the social symbolic life of the church, and the church must gain access to the social symbolic lives of people with disabilities. Mystical liberative theology resists speaking about disability without first being accountable to disabled crypt lives. Next slide, please. Mystical liberative theology encourages practices of interdependence and collective care. It resists ableist ideals of productivity and self-sufficiency. Crypt community is not built through heroic individual endurance, but through shared forms of support, pacing, rest, mutual aid, and flexibility. And finally, this 4th, which is kind of my favorite, mystical liberative theology invites communities to dream otherwise. Following Belser, this means refusing to accept the present world as inevitable. Broken elevators, inaccessible worship spaces, exhausting institutions, and rigid expectations are not simply practical inconveniences. They reveal political and theological failures of imagination. Next slide, thank you. Here, feminist, queer, crypt theorist Alison Kafer's call to, and it's on the screen, quote, imagine futures otherwise, and to cultivate a crypt politics of access and engagement becomes especially important. Mystical liberative theology similarly insists that disabled people are not merely adapting to the world as it exists, but participating in the creation of worlds otherwise. To live this approach in crypt community is to cultivate spaces where disabled crypt people can imagine, design, and practice new forms of being and knowing. Mystical liberative theology is not only a way of interpreting disability theology, but a way of inhabiting community. And it asks what becomes possible when access serves as spiritual practice, when interdependence forms theological insight, and when disabled crypt knowledge shapes communal life. We're going to go to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I invite you to wrap up with.
Yes.
Thank you.
So my argument is on the slide that disability theology requires a mystical liberative approach because our disabled crip experience reveals forms of divine encounter, theological knowledge, political resistance, and collective transformation that can only be adequately understood when spirituality, liberation, and disabled epistemology are considered together. And we're going to go to the very last slide where I am saying thank you to all. I would say that the task before us today, going forward, is really to create a new world. And really this vision, it asks us to dream this vision of a crip future otherwise. It asks us to dream with one another toward futures not yet fully realized, but already emerging wherever we, disabled crip people, like today, gather together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation, Emma. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions right now, but Emma is available to be contacted, and we'll make sure you all have her contact information and to talk between. Now we're on a break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have our second plenary. Let's thank Emma again. All right, dear ones, we are going to go ahead and get started again. Our final plenary speaker is Darla Schumm. This is Angela Malloy speaking. Darla is the author of Healing Ableism, Stories About Disability and Religious Life from Rutgers University Press in 2025. She received her BA in Interdisciplinary Studies with concentrations in history, psychology, and women's studies from Goshen College, her MA in social ethics from the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California, and her PhD in religion, ethics, and society from Vanderbilt. In addition to her 20 years as a religious studies professor at Hollins University, she is the Hollins Associate Provost for Curriculum and Faculty Engagement. Darla's research focuses on intersections between religious studies and disability studies. In addition to her most recent book, she is the co-editor of several books, including Disability and World Religions, an Introduction, which is a textbook on world religions and disability. Darla enjoys traveling, knitting, reading fiction, and spending time with her friends and her family. I had the deep joy of reviewing Darla's book, and it is brilliant. And so we're in for a treat. Will you join me in welcoming Darla?
Right. Good morning, ITD friends. It is so lovely to be back at ITD. I have a long, long history with ITD, and I think I've done one other plenary, but that was years ago. I've been on panels. I was on the organizing committee, excuse me, for a while. And so I was really delighted when Shelley emailed me earlier and asked if I would be willing to be one of your plenary speakers this year. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out. I brought my own cheering section with me today over there in the corner. One of the great things about coming to the Twin Cities is that I have family who live here. In Minnesota, I have two nieces who live here in the Twin Cities. My sister-in-law is here. She's up in northern Minnesota, along with my nephew, who also lives up in northern Minnesota. And most importantly, my newest and most favorite relative, baby Noah, who made his entrance into the world a little over 3 months ago. So they are all with me this morning, and I'm so grateful. I also really should introduce, I think he has to be my favorite relative, my beloved husband is sitting up here with me this morning, Jonathan Harris. Yes, cheers to Jonathan. Jonathan is an Episcopal priest. He is a canon for transition ministry and pastoral care for the Diocese of Southwestern Virginia when he's not hanging out with me. And this morning, Jonathan is actually going to be reading some excerpts for me from the book. And I'll explain that a little more in a minute. So I'm also very grateful to him for helping me out this morning and always. So without further ado, when I was 8 years old, I was diagnosed with a life-changing disability. My parents and I spent the better part of a year traveling back and forth from northern Indiana, where we lived, to the University of Michigan, where I underwent a barrage of tests trying to figure out why an 8-year-old girl could no longer read the blackboard from the first row of her classroom. Over the course of that year, my parents were given a number of options for my diagnosis. One was that I would have a brain tumor and most likely die within the year. Another was that I would eventually be totally blind. And another was that I would have a condition that would not leave me completely blind, but had no cure. In addition to entrusting my care to the rational medical world, my parents invoked their belief in an omnipotent, benevolent God. And many times after my medical testing, we spent time with our Mennonite church family where they laid hands on me and prayed for my healing. I obviously did not die. The less bad news, the happy outcome, which was the least bad of not great options, was that I was diagnosed with a form of juvenile macular degeneration, which left me with some vision, although at this point I describe myself as functionally blind. I had no idea as an 8-year-old that my diagnosis was already weaving together the tapestry of my personal and professional life. I began on a lifelong journey of thinking about the connections between disability and religion. And while it took me years to embrace and celebrate that I was a person with a disability, at this moment in time, I cannot imagine who I would be without my disability. It has formed every aspect of how I think about and move through the world. So fast forward about 50 years, 40 or 50 years. I can't believe I'm saying that. And I was engaged on a scholarly level with the intersection of religious and disability studies. And I started paying a lot of attention to the religious communities that I encountered and reflecting back on the religious communities that I encountered throughout my life. At the same time, I was having conversations with friends and colleagues who were also disabled and talking about the types of experiences that they had in religious communities and organizations. And before I knew it, I was doing research for a book. I conducted sociological research, which means I did semi-structured interviews with a variety of people with disabilities. I'm not sure if any of the people I interviewed are in the room today, but I do know that several of them have been active members of ITD. So semi-structured interviews mean that I had a list of questions that I started with, but I let the interviews unfold in a natural conversational progression. And the result of those interviews is my recent book, Healing Ableism. So today I'm going to talk about the outcome of that research and highlight a couple of the themes that emerged from my interviews and that I write about in the book. And you may pick up on my screen reader if you hear a computer voice jabbering. So, as I spoke with people, what emerged were examples of ableism that people with disabilities were experiencing in their religious contexts. Two themes emerged out of those interviews that I'm going to talk about today, two common experiences. And those are what I call controlling images and CRIP tests. So, controlling images. Patricia Hill Collins, in her groundbreaking book, Black Feminist Thought, defines controlling images as, and now I'm going to check my notes, as negative and stereotypical images and representations that produce, reinforce, and perpetuate inequality through interlocking systems of racism, classism, and sexism. And I'm going to say that one more time because it's a mouthful. Controlling images are negative and stereotypical images and representations that produce, reinforce, and perpetuate inequality through interlocking systems of racism, classism, and sexism. And I would add ableism. So Hill Collins is focusing on the controlling images of Black women. I borrow her concept of controlling images and ask, what are the controlling images that surface most frequently for people with disabilities in religious communities and organizations? The two that popped up almost without exception in every single interview and in my own life were the controlling images of the sinner and the saint. And these may sound familiar. I think I heard a "that's right" out there. So I imagine that there are some of you who have run into these same controlling images. The sinner, of course, is the idea that those of us who are disabled, if we just prayed hard enough, God would cure our disability and take away all of our sins. So somehow we are responsible for our disability, and it is because of sin, whether a past deed, as in the Buddhist tradition of karma, or something that we, or in some cases, our parents did that caused the disability. Max, one of my interviewees, illustrates well the sinner controlling image. And here's where Jonathan comes in. He is going to read an excerpt from the book about Max. Woo! It's not on. Oh.
You need to flip the switch on the microphone itself.
Max,
There we go.
a self-described retired Baptist minister in his early 60s, described many of the elements of the sinner-controlling image as he told me his story. Max joked that retired was a bit of a misnomer, given that he maintained a busy schedule of preaching, teaching, and writing. By his late 30s, Max had a PhD, was working full-time as a minister, and was, as he put it, positioned to rise in denominational life, end quote. In the midst of his busy and by all accounts successful ministerial career, Max began having problems with detached retinas. Quote, after 3 attempts to repair the retina in each eye, the doctor just kind of ran out of retina. I was totally blind from that point forward, end quote. Max's blindness stems from diabetic retinopathy, a complication of his long-term diabetes. Max struggled with common questions after the onset of disability, asking, why me? And I have all these things on my resume, but how am I ever going to use them anymore? Bolstered by his faith, church community, and a forthright nurse, however, Max transitioned from sight to blindness with relative ease. Recalling a pep talk from a nurse while he was in the hospital, Max described how he approaches his disability. Quote, one of the nurses there, an African-American woman, probably in her 50s, early 60s, came in one day when I was quite grumpy, and she gave me a good talking to. God's not finished with you yet, she said. You need to move forward. You need to move beyond these things that have happened here and find what it is that God can use you to do, she said. Concurrently with that, there was one of the most intense personal spiritual experiences that I can recall of sensing God's affirmation that, quote, you need to know that you're the person that I created you to be. You just can't see anymore. And that has sort of been my motivating spiritual affirmation. And a testament to how deeply his spiritual affirmation penetrates his life, Max not only continued on his successful career path for the next 20 plus years, but with an intrepid spirit, some creative ingenuity, and the help of friends and family, he also enthusiastically returned to water skiing, a sport he had loved as a sighted person. Max's eventual positive and matter-of-fact attitude toward disability was not always matched by other members of his religious community. Steeped in the biblical literalism tradition of the Southern Baptist denomination, Max encountered folks who interpreted his disability as a negative sign or message from God. Quote, I had a carload of ministers who had read a newspaper article about me show up at the office one day, and they wanted to come in and anoint me with oil and pray that my faith would increase so that I could be healed of my blindness. My faith was obviously standing in the way of my healing, end quote. In extreme cases, a few people even linked Max's more liberal approach to theology with God's judgment and his disability. Quote, some people have thought that I should be able to understand that God is finished with me. My theology is different enough from the good ultra-conservative Baptist upbringing they have that they believe this is God's way of making sure that I wouldn't be leading anyone astray with my terrible theology. end quote.
Pray harder. Faith will be restored. Sin will be eradicated. Full health will return. So goes the sinner controlling image. The saint controlling image perhaps is a more desirable way to be thought of, unless you believe that sinners have more fun. But the saint controlling image, of course, is that notion that those of us with disabilities somehow live saintly lives, more saintly than the rest of you. We are put on a pedestal as moral exemplars for the rest of our community. We are the living embodiment of how to survive suffering and hardship. Ella, another one of my interviewees, captures the feelings of many of my interviewees when she talks about her experiences of being seen as a saint.
Ella, another of my interviewees, almost burst through the phone with her energy and zest for life. She told me about her experiences in a variety of religious communities, from growing up in a Christian Reformed tradition to attending a Christian school to worshiping briefly in a Jewish synagogue to finding a home in an Episcopal church. Ella was born with cerebral palsy. Ella echoed what many of my other interviewees said about their frustrations with being put on a pedestal by Christian friends. Quote, even before I was able to articulate that, like, I would sit around with these friends of mine in high school and we would talk about how annoyed we were that people would think that, we were all of a sudden these super Christians because we go about living our lives, right? But that sort of looking back, that really sort of set off something for me. It's like I became really aware, I think, during that time that Christians in particular look at me and they, more often than not, they assume that I'm some sort of saint.
The challenge with being a saint is that you can never admit when life is hard or challenging, because you are expected to be the role model for how to live a super Christian, superhuman life. While the sinner and the saint controlling images appear to be on opposite ends of the spectrum, they actually share remarkably similar patterns that I call problematic parallels. Whether sinner or saint, disability dwells squarely in the individual impaired body. It's a failure, a lack, a flaw of the individual body, not a communal, social, or collective issue to be dealt with. Second, whether sinner or saint, a sharp dichotomy is created between us and them. We, the disabled, are always the other, always separate from the able-bodied. Third, whether sinner or saint, disability is always cast as suffering and therefore undesirable. And finally, whether sinner or saint, the response elicited is always pity. I'm sorry for you. I'm sorry that you live with this challenge or affliction. The second overarching theme that emerged from my interviews, in addition to controlling images, is what I call CRIP tests. And I have to say that I also borrowed this phrase from a scholar and former colleague and good friend of mine, who is a sociologist and a critical race theorist, and he writes extensively about race tests. And so I'm, again, borrowing his concept of race tests and applying it to disability. So, sorry, catching up on my notes here. So CRIP tests are the ways in which able-bodied people regulate and control if and how people with disabilities are integrated into the life of the community, thereby maintaining an able-bodied embodiment as the dominant form of embodiment, or what many scholars have referred to as the non-identity. So once again, CRIP tests are the ways in which able-bodied people regulate and control if and how people with disabilities are integrated into the life of the community. And so this is how they ensure that their able-bodied identity is the norm, the dominant, or the non-identity. I identified a number of ways that CRIP tests show up, particularly in religious contexts and communities. And I want to be really clear to say that in no way do I mean to imply that religious communities are actively conspiring against people with disabilities. Much of what emerged through my interviews and research showed me how these attitudes and practices kind of lurk beneath the surface and are often happening unintentionally. So these are good folks, well-intentioned, well-meaning folks who often are enacting controlling images or CRIP tests without intending to be ableist. But part of what I hope to do through my book and my work is to unearth some of the ways that these things are happening in our communities, and then to offer some alternatives for redressing them. So, the two crypt tests that I'm going to talk briefly about today are inspiration porn and the weaponization of prayer. Ooh. I like the responses. For those of you on Zoom, the audience is very responsive this morning. So inspiration porn is a term that some of you may be very familiar with. The late Australian disability activist Stella Young, I believe, was the first person to coin this phrase. And it is exactly what it sounds like. And it has a lot of overlap with the saint controlling image. It's this notion, again, that those of us who live with disabilities are so inspiring. One of the common examples that shows up in the disability studies literature of inspiration porn is the Jerry Lewis telethon, where children with disabilities were paraded across the stage, the TV screen, to raise money, and these tragic characters who inspire all of us to do better and be better and give to charity. Again, not unnoble causes, but disabled bodies are mobilized in ways that are less than helpful, respective, and don't inspire equality and justice. In my own life, I have encountered inspiration porn many, many, many times. And again, those of you in the audience and joining us virtually, I'm sure many of you have had these experiences as well. One that always comes to mind for me and demonstrates how complicated these types of experiences are is I think fondly about a late aunt of mine who I spent a lot of time with as a child. And I have vivid memories of this aunt telling me what a special young woman I was. And she used the language of inspiration, how inspiring I was, how she believed that God had a special plan for me, and that part of that plan was to be an inspiration to my family and friends because of the way I handled my disability or because of the way I lived my life. And usually her accolades would end by telling me how remarkable I was. Make no mistake, I am remarkable and humble. But again, like the saint controlling image, it gets a little bit exhausting to always be an inspiration for other people. And yet, I joke about being remarkable, but there are moments when I want to pause and say, hey, this is hard. I celebrate disability and it's hard. Some days are harder than others. And so there's that tricky balance between not wanting to be an inspiration, but kind of wanting to be an inspiration, to get the recognition that getting a PhD was a wee bit harder for me than a lot of people because I couldn't read in the typical way. And again, I'm sure many of you have other examples. It's particularly complicated when these compliments come from people we love and who we know love us. Again, which is often the case in our religious communities. The weaponization of prayer. This is one of my favorite crypt tests in a way. Again, coming from a good place, and as you might imagine, the weaponization of prayer is how religious communities, religious individuals use disabled bodies as a way to display the power of prayer in whatever form that takes, thereby also displaying God's power and glory. So a couple of my interviewees illustrate the weaponization of prayer. And again, I'll turn to Jonathan.
Melissa, a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA with mobility disabilities, labeled unsolicited prayer offered on her behalf as, quote, bad theology. Quote, the only times that I run into problems are with some individuals who feel like they have to pray for me, saying, we'll pray for you to be healed, end quote. I tell people, I'm no longer praying for healing. I'm praying for patience. I'm praying for I'm praying for other things in the world. I'm praying to be able to do the job God's given me to do. But healing is not something that I'm praying for because I don't think it's in my cards. This is how I am. This is how I'm meant to be. And so don't pray for me to be healed because I don't believe that's going to happen. End quote. Lisa, a blind Methodist minister, shares Melissa's frustration with people who want to pray for her complete healing. She tells a humorous story that illustrates what happens when bad theology, quote unquote, and the reality of disability collide. Quote, I had one guy who was internationally known more in the evangelical world as a healer, and he anointed my eyes and prayed over me, saying, open your eyes. What can you see? Nothing? Okay, well, let's pray again. Open your eyes. What can you see? Nothing? Okay, let's pray again. He did it about 4 times, and finally it was like, okay, the Lord be with you.
So controlling images and crypt tests are vivid, and I would argue enraging examples of ableism. I argue that rage is an appropriate response to injustice, to denying the full humanity of other people, to ableism. Throughout the book, I invite readers to join me in raging against ableism. But I also argue that rage is not enough. Our rage must be accompanied by an equally strong desire for healing. But here, friends, I am not talking about healing in the sense that our culture, our religious communities, many of the people that we encounter along the way conceive of healing. Here, I am talking about healing ableism. As I write, it's not disability that needs the healing, it's ableism that needs the healing. And this ultimately is what I invite readers and all of you to join me in doing. So how do we do it? What's the work? How do we do the work of raging against and healing ableism? Of course, there's no one answer, but I propose accessible love as a way to heal ableism. Accessible love is hard to define. It's a little bit like attempting to define disability. It is constantly changing. It's different in different contexts and situations. It's amorphous. Accessible love varies from context to context. The power of accessible love is that it is action in motion. Accessible love demands constant attentiveness to the inclusion and accessibility needs of every member of every community. Accessible love is an orientation toward justice. It reorients our hearts, attitudes, minds, and practices. I borrow much of how I understand and define accessible love from luminaries such as Dr. Martin Luther King, Bell Hooks, womanist theologian Carrie Day, all of whom write about the beloved community. From their work, accessible love is grounded in political activism that impacts public policies, religious practices, and attitudes, and cultural beliefs about ability and disability. Accessible love celebrates difference and attempts to ensure that all difference is honored and respected. Several of my interviewees demonstrated accessible love. And for one last time, I will ask Jonathan to read their stories.
As a rabbi, Lauren devotes much of her time and energy to community organizing and disability education and justice. She writes, lectures, leads workshops and discussions, and grants interviews for Jewish communities, serving to transform into more just, equitable, inclusive, and accessible spaces. In an Eli talk, the Jewish version of a TED talk, Lauren draws from a moment in the Torah that centers justice and inclusion. In the talk titled "We Were All at Sinai: The Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah," Lauren observes that all of the Israelites were included at Sinai when Moses received the divine law, 10 Commandments, from God, Exodus 19 through 24. All the Israelites received the divine law from Moses. All the Israelites entered the covenant with God. No Israelite was left out. God did not single out a privileged few who were expected to receive and follow the commandments. God did not exclude anybody from the expectations or protections of the covenantal relationship. The covenant moment at Sinai established the standards of radical inclusion and participation in the life of the community. If, as Judaism and other theistic religions maintain, humans should imitate God in all things, then it is incumbent on religious communities to mimic the divine posture of radical inclusion as established at Sinai. Like Lauren, James also blends his work as a religious leader with disability activism and advocacy. The story that I'm about to recount is yet another story about ableism and discrimination, but its power lies in James's response, which also gives us another example of how to practice accessible love. After he graduated with a Master's of Divinity degree, James declared that he wanted to be a pastor. The ordination process in James's denomination involves multiple steps, including interviews with clergy, bishops, and ordaining boards, as well as a field placement in a church. The process did not flow smoothly for James. Quote, during the probationary period, well, even before I got to that point, after graduating from seminary and declaring that I wanted to get certified as a pastor, I would make it until one point before being considered for going on to commissioning. I kept getting sent back to my local district to the board of ordained ministry, end quote. James did not initially understand why he kept getting stalled in the process. Eventually, another clergy person discovered what was happening and reported back to James. Quote, I found out later that there was one pastor who kept blocking me because he did not see how I could serve effectively as a pastor as someone who was blind, end quote. Faced with blatant ableism and being told yet again that he did not belong, James got creative. Quote, when I realized who the pastor who kept blocking me was, I made it my business to get into his life, end quote. James reported to me with no malice. As a candidate for ordination, James needed another pastor to serve as his mentor. James knew that his adversary's wife was also a pastor. With a hint of smile in his voice, James said, quote, I asked if this pastor's wife would be my mentor, which meant that he, the adversary, was at every event that I ever did, because I would invite my mentor and she brought her husband, end quote. James went on to tell me about one of the events that his mentor and husband attended. James organized and led a disability awareness forum for a local church called Beyond Accessibility. After the event, James's skeptic approached him with tears in his eyes and said, I am so sorry, I did not know. End quote. Quote, if you didn't know the background, James mused, you would think that he was saying that he didn't know all of the things about the difficulty that people with disabilities go through in the ordination process, or the way they are treated in churches, like always being on the periphery. He probably didn't know about any of that. But he was also saying that he did not know that I could do an activity like that. From that moment on, he has become my greatest advocate, end quote. In a much quieter tone, James reflected, quote, so it's changing hearts, changing minds, end quote.
Accessible love is grounded in the principles of radical inclusion as established at Sinai. It's changing hearts and changing minds. Accessible love combines radical beliefs and practices. It is the radical belief that every body is worthy and deserves to be valued and included in every community. It is a set of radical practices, religious or otherwise, that ensures full inclusion, belonging, equity, and justice. I invite all of you to join me in the sacred, compassionate justice work of healing ableism. Thank you. Thank you. So I think we have time for a few questions. I recognize that I'm probably all that's between you and lunch. And I know your brains are very full because you've had many wonderful panels and talks. But if there are a few questions, I'm happy to take questions, or I have questions to ask you if you don't have any for me.
Thank you so much, Darla. We are going to give ourselves just a moment to pause, to let everything soak in. For those of you who are internal processors or have other access needs, just to give you a chance to also formulate questions. And then we will start with a question online. So our folks, if you have a question online or if you want to raise your hand. We'll go ahead and begin by inviting Rabbi Julia to ask her question.
Hi, Darla. This is Julia Watts-Belzer. So nice to hear your amazing, brilliant talk and to be in connection with you. I wanted to ask you to say if you might say a little bit more about the crip test concept. I found both of the elements that you described there so familiar and so frustrating, vexing. But I think that I also hear you saying that these function in a kind of as like a litmus test of do you get to belong? And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that or correct me if in fact I've missed the boat.
Hi, Julia. It's lovely to hear your voice. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here yesterday because I know you all had the treat of hearing from Julia. Yeah, thank you for that question. So you're exactly right, Julia. Crip tests, and I describe them obviously much more extensively in the book. They are exactly as you said, a litmus test for how and who gets to belong in religious communities. And so they're kind of a way of regulating. And in the book, I break them down into attitudes and practices, and the way in which they're a test is that it's kind of the way that people with disabilities respond to things like inspiration porn or the weaponization of prayer, determines the community's welcome or not, or embrace, or rejection is maybe a little too strong. I think there are very few religious communities that outright reject. So this is a little more subtle, but if someone like Melissa, the first story that Jonathan read, I would say that she is an example of someone who is resisting a crypt test. I mean, she is saying, hey, no, don't pray for me for healing. This is bad theology. I don't want that. And the crypt test there is, does she allow her disabled body to be this vehicle for prayer in a way that she doesn't want? Or does she push back and challenge the community and say, no, let's think about this differently? And the crypt test will be the way in which then the community responds. Do they say, oh, I never thought about it that way. You mean you don't want me to pray for you to be physically healed? Well, let's have a conversation about that. I'd like to understand that. Or if they're uncomfortable with that and unable to kind of open their minds or ways of understanding disability in a different light. So I hope that clarifies, but I use the very phrase litmus test in the book, that they really are a litmus test. And in some contexts, and I get into this whole thing about inclusion and accessibility, can be very literal. It can be accommodations and adjustments to buildings, but it doesn't have to be. That's not the end of the story. There are plenty of religious and other communities that are very welcoming and inclusive, for whom their physical space is not particularly accessible. But I tell some other stories. Ella, the same woman from the Saint story, talked a lot about a community that was, the space was very inaccessible, but the community members said to her, okay, we've got this event. We want you there. We're going to figure out how to get you there. We're going to make sure you can participate fully. And it's on us to do this work. We're going to pick you up literally if we have to get you into the space. So I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Okay.
Hi, thank you. Hi, E.L. Porter. One of the conversations we've been having over the conference is how some people have a disability that's not readily apparent.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if some of these crypt tests deal with things like that, where if we can't immediately identify what you need, then you don't
Need.
right. You don't need right. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a whole other line of conversation, right? The non-apparent disabilities, and how and when do we reveal our non-apparent disabilities, and to what extent does a community have a responsibility to provide accommodations that they may not even be aware of. And this is where I would again say that accessible love, part of what I hope is helpful about that concept is that there's not a formula for what it means. It is context driven. It's not a stagnant, stable idea. And so the challenge is for religious communities in their contexts to constantly be attentive. Accessible love isn't one and done. Neither is excessive love, I guess. Um, um, Accessible love is not okay, we did this, now we're done, the work is done. It is a constant ongoing conversation. And so for communities where there are people with non-apparent disabilities, there has to be conversation. And I would love to live in a world where those of us with disabilities, apparent or non-apparent, don't always have to be the people in the room raising our hands saying, hey, we have to talk about this, or we have to think about this. So the challenge is for communities to be asking before the need is necessarily stated. And it's a dance. Because the other thing we don't want is for people, communities to be telling us what our needs are and what accommodations we need. So there's a real accessibility dance, if you will. But it's about being in relationship and conversation and dialogue. And it doesn't just apply to disability, right? Exclusion, inaccessibility, inequity happens in many other ways. So I also hope that this concept can apply beyond just disability conversations, or maybe not beyond, but inclusive of disability and many, many other types of conversations. What do you need to feel as though you belong in this community, whether it's evident to me that there's something that is keeping you from full participation? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Rabbi Lauren to ask her question.
Hi, Lauren.
Hey, Darla. This is Lauren Tuckman speaking. It's so good to hear your voice. Yeah, I loved your talk. The question that I have that's kind of emerging from your conversation today is in the realm of the question around rejection, right? Because you stated, and forgive me if I'm saying this wrong, that like most religious communities aren't like actively conspiring against us, right? But like
Right.
it actually happens all the time. Like there are ways in
Right.
which people feel a sense of non-belonging.
Yeah.
So, as often happens in this line of work, I got an email communication from someone unsolicited recently, basically talking about how ableist religious communities are. And I was wondering if you have some tips of like thinking about how we navigate the coversion of ableism when these communities and the oversion, like and the overt ableism, right? Like how do we hold both on the one hand that actually I think I would agree with you on balance that most religious communities are not actively conspiring against us. And on the other side of that coin, the way that people are feeling such a shaky sense of belonging today, and especially in the last few years, given where we are in the world right now, just like with all of the various factors coming together, how do we navigate thinking about accessible love in that frame?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lauren. So I just have to say that Lauren is one of my interviewees. She was the Rabbi Lauren from the last story, and I should have said this at the outset. I use pseudonyms for all of my interviewees except Rabbi Lauren, because it was going to be so obvious who she was if anyone knew her, because she is the first ordained female rabbi with a disability. And so I did ask her permission to use her real name. And she very graciously said yes. And just because it's funny, the first time I interviewed Lauren, I forgot to turn the tape recorder on. So we had to do a second interview, which was awesome because I got to talk to her twice. Anyway, so wow, that's a big question. And I do not claim to be the expert on this. And I'm sure there are many people in the room and online who could answer this as well as I can, because I think, and feel free to jump in, Lauren, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think part of what you're asking is kind of where do we do a risk assessment? Because this is a scary, risky, dangerous time. And there actually are people and institutions who are very overt about their lack of inclusion these days and their desire to keep people with disabilities and many, many, many other marginalized communities out. And so what is an accessible love response? You know, I think to the extent that those of us who enjoy a certain amount of privilege in this world are able to challenge those moments of overt, whether intentional or unintentional, exclusion and discrimination. Part of accessible love is that rage, right? That rage piece, and harnessing the power of anger for the work of love. And I talk about this in the book. There are a couple of scholars I rely on. The late feminist ethicist Beverly Wildung Harrison has an essay actually called The Power of Anger in the Work of Love. A Buddhist teacher and activist, Lama Rod Owen, talks about that there's wisdom in anger. And when wisdom is coupled with compassion, the work of love can happen. And so, and accessible love means that there are times when it's too dangerous. And we have to know when we need to protect ourselves and our community. So I'm not sure I'm giving you a very satisfactory answer, but I would hope that those of us who can will push back in those moments and do what we can to stand up and challenge the overt moments, experiences, acts of outright discrimination, ableism, racism, sexism, trans and homophobia, and so on. But I'd welcome any thoughts you, Lauren, or anyone has, because it's a really important question.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Hey, I'm Sam. Been reading your book. It's been fantastic. I want to just drill down. I've been having these connections while listening to Emma's talk and yours now with liberation, mysticism, and healing ableism. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about the I guess it's inspirational porn, but the inspirational Christ or the inspirational central religious figure that controls what the community or what we might look like, and whether the liberative action of the idea of your what is it, accessible love and mysticism is the recreation of re-representation of these images in our liturgies, in our artistic portrayals, etc. Yeah.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. You're asking specifically in a Christian context?
Yeah, from a Christian context, but yeah, I'm a Christian, so from a Christian context, but I guess there are also central figures in different religions and faiths as well. Yeah.
And so you're asking how those figures can kind of inspire a new way of,
or how they might be controlling because they've been portrayed in a certain way, and whether you've thought about those. Yeah.
so if they're controlling how bodies are thought of. Am I totally not following you? Where's Emma? I think Emma should answer this one. Yeah, I caught part of Emma's talk. I didn't hear the whole thing. I was here for the end of it. So, I am not sure I've thought about this, and I would love to engage more. Yeah, I representations, I talk about religious art a little bit in the book, and kind of not so much the ways that the central religious figure, in the case of Christianity, of course, Jesus, is represented, but more how the disabled body is represented in religious art. But I do think we need a more capacious understanding, a more expansive understanding of the divine, the religious figures in our respective traditions. And I think I do, and all joking aside, I think Emma's work is pushing us in that direction, and she really might be a better one to speak to this. But yeah, I need to think on that one.
Let's thank Darla again.
Thank you.
Before we start lunch, one announcement. All books are half off. Please get your books. They're all half, 50%, however you want to calculate it or say it. And it's time for lunch.
We will be back in 1 hour for our afternoon sessions. See y'all then. And please join the hybrid networking sessions, please, in 3:41.